Hello, my name's Rachel Macfarlane and I'm a PhD student studying at De Montfort University and the University of Warwick in the UK. In the other part of my time, I work for the National Lottery Heritage Fund. This paper on my research explores cultural value through the lens of coastal heritage. It examines cultural values amongst users and non-users of built Victorian heritage, over time, as space and in place. It considers the significance of the coastal landscape in creating a sense of place for communities and visitors through a case study of the Great Yarmouth Winter Gardens in the east of England. The Winter Gardens stand derelict, a space continuously repurposed to function for business, leisure and pleasure. This has included being used as a dance hall, conference centre, ice skating rink, German beer garden and more recently a soft play centre until 2008 when it was closed permanently due to the poor condition of the building. Over 120 years the building has acted as an attraction and after 20 years of closure now faces the opportunity for a major capital transformation. As seaside resorts rose in popularity during the 19th century in England, councils keen to attract visitors invested in new forms of entertainment to compete with one another. In 1889, the Great Yarmouth Corporation purchased the Britannia Pier and planned to create a pavilion, gardens and a winter garden. Then in 1903 came the opportunity to purchase the redundant Torquay glass building. It had cost Torquay £12,783 to build in 1881, having been unsuccessful as a business and built on the hill in Torquay. The Great Yarmouth Corporation snapped it up for a bargain £1,300, its scrap value. The 5,000 panes of glass were transported by sea and reconstructed on the seafront of Great Yarmouth. Opened by the High Sheriff of Great Yarmouth on the 4th of June 1904, he described it as the last link of a chain of marvellous improvements to afford accommodation and amusement to visitors and make their lives there pleasant and healthy. It has since been used for all sorts of purposes, closing in 2008. My research interest in this building stems from an interest through my professional practice working with seaside towns and councils on their cultural strategies. It brings together the nuance between built Victorian heritage and the natural heritage of the coastline in these areas. There is significant need, opportunity and investment happening in coastal towns. In Great Yarmouth, this building is on the Historic England Heritage at Risk Register. It also has 2 Historic England High Street Heritage Action Zones. It is an Arts Council England priority place and the recipient of the government's Levelling Up Towns funding. The perceptions and hierarchy of value amongst policymakers makes it an interesting study for practice and investment in cultural studies. There are opportunities for human-centred study and gaps in cultural value discourse. At the National Lottery Heritage Fund, we define heritage by saying, we ask you to tell us what you think is important and should be protected and preserved, from historic buildings, our industrial legacy and the natural environment, to collections, traditions, stories and more. Heritage can be anything from the past that you value and want to pass on to future generations. The idea of heritage as being something subjectively valued is implicit here. Amongst sociologists, geographers, anthropologists and environmental psychologists, the development of place and conception of space has resulted in a range of methodologies and frameworks being developed. Ultimately, this paper will suggest that it is within the experienced sense of place that cultural value resides. More recent studies have argued a need to widen multidisciplinary methodologies to place in order to understand how and why people form emotional attachments to historic places. The need for interdisciplinary learning, leading to people-centred methodologies, is gaining traction amongst cultural value discourse. It can be argued that rural and coastal landscapes have been under-researched in relation to cultural value. Landscape combines the physical features of the natural environment with the cultural imprints of human behaviour over time, reflecting an organic medley of people and place and defining local settings. The concept of liminal space is a dominant area of research amongst cultural geographers and anthropologists. Coastal seaside places have been associated with ludic, consumptive, carnivalesque, inversive behaviours, or those where social and moral expectations can be suspended. Academics have reflected on the changing nature of the communities that live in these places and how the loss of industry and migration have impacted the perception of the experience of these places. For instance, Andrews and Roberts in 2012 used the example of Margate. Margate is marginal in terms of physical location on the edge of the land, marginal to holiday-taking practices in terms of its decline in popularity as a seaside resort, marginal as a cultural landscape in relation to dominant narratives and geographies of nationhood, and marginal in the sense of playing host to groups who are in some way marginalised from the fabric of mainstream society. The sense of escapism that may be experienced by holiday makers to the coast in stark contrast to the surveillance and isolation that might be experienced by migrant communities that are all too often housed there. The focus on place in heritage-led regeneration, the creative industries and museums, and the UK Levelling Up policy is bringing further nuance to cultural value discourse. The methodology for this multidisciplinary study involves the analysis of denotations of cultural value in historical archives and associated documentation, past and present, including more recent policy, press and social media. Consideration is given to historical buildings as liminal spaces, and therefore the value is transitionary and individually experienced. In cultural policy, research and discourse, different methodologies are required to understand the emotional bonds and possibilities of being that can be evoked through a combination of built and natural heritage within regional coastal landscapes. Government departments use administrative definitions of place. In terms of policy, it is defined at a local government level, whether that is city, county, borough council, or unitary authority, for instance. As part of the Levelling Up agenda in England, places were identified and prioritised using needs-based analysis for various funding programmes, including Stronger Towns, Levelling Up, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and the Cultural Development Fund. An algorithm for drivers of success were built around 6 types of capital that lead to the social and economic prosperity of these places. The tension that lies behind both the government and arm's-length bodies' prioritisation of place also sits at the heart of the cultural value debate. This is whether arts, culture and heritage have value in their own right or within the difference they make to people's lives, whose lives and how. This boils down to the justification for public spending and public benefit. The idea of cultural, social and symbolic capital, as distinct to traditional economic capital, plays an integral role within our social position and positioning in the world as an important aspect of imagined place. Sociological and philosophical considerations of our experience of being in the world raises questions about the role place and culture play in our lives. Access to capital and Marxist perceptions of who it is for, who it isn't, the production of cultural taste, and the consumption and marketing of culture for the masses demonstrates the complexity of imagined place in the world and how and why people might value culture. These are important considerations in relation to social mobility and place. Think, for example, of the term "I know my place" and how this is used to infer an understanding of one's inferior position to that of another. The idea of how heritage is valued, therefore, gives rise to a number of key points. Positionality defines place, and interrelationship between people and places calls for the greater use of phenomenological methodologies. My research seeks to demonstrate how the distinctive characteristics of coastal communities and heritage are rich and under-researched in this discourse. When we consider place and cultural capital as socially constructed, it raises important questions about interpretation and display of places. This is where traditional conceptions of value might come into question, alongside political initiatives, planning decisions, and other drivers for economic regeneration. The cultural economist David Throsby suggests breaking down the notion of cultural value into its constituent elements: aesthetic value, spiritual value, social value, historic value, symbolic value, and authenticity value. That's from Throsby, 2001. These various attempts to break down cultural value into more basic components represent efforts to capture the complexity of cultural value without excluding or prioritising specific aspects of it. It's a quote from Krosick and Kanczynski, 2016. We see this tension between the physical and phenomenological manifest in cultural value discourse, and continued obsession with quantitative methods applied within the research commissioned by heritage agencies. To coin a phrase by Belladix, the habitus of heritage. Our sense of identity, class, and cultural value are of increasing interest in the field of cultural and museum studies. Belladix's article re-examines a series of interviews through the lens of Bourdieu's habitus, with reference to Sharon MacDonald's research into the Science Museum, proposing that visitors bring their prior cultural framings through which they both decode and recode an exhibition. Whether the capital is symbolic or intellectual, depending on how far participants are willing to adopt these stories within their own habitus and own lived experience and cultural framings of these stories. David Wright, in 2022, explores the emergence and rise of the commemoration of statues of comedians in UK towns during the 21st century within the context of political shifts and development of popular culture. The conclusion drawn is that investment into statues representing popular cultural nostalgia challenges our assumptions about the cultural lives of towns. This points to an indisputable tension within the cultural value debate. In heritage terms, whose heritage and who pays for it? Hazel Andrews in 2012 did a study of Crosby Beach's Anthony Gormley sculptures Another Place, addressing similar considerations within the context of coastal regeneration, making the argument that the sculptures themselves are liminoid. As faceless and positioned on the beach, their transitionary state and sexless appearance enables individual reflections to be projected onto them. Most importantly, perhaps, is the unusual beach behaviour amongst participants is mostly unchanged in response to the presence of the sculptures. The experience happens to the individual in thoughts and feelings more than in modes of behaviour. Concluding that Crosby Beach is not a liminal space, it is part of everyday people's behaviours. The artwork itself is liminoid because it is in a zone of status, to draw on Andrews and Roberts' 2012, both physically and metaphorically. Reflecting on the driver and evaluation for the production of the statues, Andrews concludes responses were merely counted, thus missing the opportunity to analyse their meanings. The survey was clearly designed to assess the success of attraction in terms of visitor numbers, and as such serves as a measurement of its regeneration potential only. These reflections have significance for my study of the Great Yarmouth Winter Gardens and the role of community consultation, interpretation and future use within planning. I'm mindful of my positionality as both a researcher and as an employee for the National Lottery Heritage Fund, a significant investor within Great Yarmouth. This study presents the opportunity for longitudinal research. The transformation of the space presents a chance to ask, what is the experience of the Winter Gardens over time, through both the 5-year transformation of capital redevelopment, but potentially also through the 120 years of denotations of cultural value within historical archives and material culture. With the question, what is it like to experience the Winter Gardens? There is an opportunity to look at interpretive phenomenological analysis and to give careful consideration to the choice of interview participants for this study. As I'm in my first year of this 6-year research, I welcome thoughts and feedback. If you're interested in hearing more about my research, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, or via LinkedIn. And to find out more about the investment from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, visit www.heritagefund.org.uk. Thank you very much.